everyone. I'm happy to be here with you all and talk about academic language and content area. As all of you know, this is a really important topic, and I think one that's receiving more and more sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once and it doesn't always work. That's receiving more and more attention because we know, especially when it comes to reading comprehension, which is one of the areas that many children have difficulty with, what we're learning are a couple of things. Other than what we know in terms of just developing comprehension, we know that vocabulary and language have a big impact on comprehension and also background knowledge. And so that's one of the reasons for really thinking about content area instruction from an early age. And we'll talk here about how, especially for students who are learning English as a second language, it's important that we start developing the background knowledge, but also all the language associated with it when we begin instruction from the earliest grades through high school. So first of all, maybe I do need you, Brad, to do the poll because I've kind of lost it here on my screen. Hold on, I'll move this.
Sylvia, I can do that.
Yeah, could you please?
Yeah, absolutely. Just let me know when you want me to launch it.
Yeah, now.
Perfect.
Thanks. So just so I know who's here, who has joined us this morning, could you please let me know what your role is at your school? Okay, so it looks like we have a lot of others. Would some of you who have chosen that just undo your mute button and just say what it is that you do?
District instructional mentor.
Okay. Anything else?
School psychologist.
Okay. Others?
Teacher on a special assignment.
Okay. Anybody else?
Somebody in the chat said teacher preparation.
Yep, higher ed and graduate research assistants. Great. Well, it's great to have you all here. I'll tell you a little bit about myself in case you don't know. My name is Sylvia Linan Thompson. I'm on the faculty at the University of Oregon. I've been here in Oregon for 6 years now and happy to be here. My area of research is with English learners, has been since before I was a faculty member. I was a bilingual ed and an ESL teacher for 8 years in elementary school. And since then have done a lot of research around reading and reading development, worked on reading interventions for kids who are struggling readers, both monolingual English speakers and emergent bilinguals in both English and Spanish. Have worked around content area and literacy too with middle school children. And finally, now I'm doing a lot of work in writing development. But my focus has always been with English learners because it's a population that I was first interested in. My very first degree, my undergrad degree, was a bilingual ed ESL teacher certificate. So it's been something that I have been passionate about for a lot of years. So for today, I'm going to put, what I have done here is I've put together a framework that integrates the 4 communicative components of listening, speaking, reading, and writing to build academic, language, and disciplinary literacy across grade levels. And this is a multi-component approach that includes effective practices for both academic language, disciplinary knowledge, and reading comprehension. And it comes from a number of studies I've worked on and have interventions I have developed across the years. and pieces of which we mostly implemented in middle school and high school, but then other pieces that we implemented at lower grades in elementary school. So it really is sort of a culmination of many years of work, but there are practices that we have implemented in classrooms. So just to get going a little bit, what are your students' greatest challenges in learning content, I'm sorry. So if you just want to pop your answer in the chat box. Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, not great that they're having these challenges, but thank you for your responses. I see a lot of background knowledge, vocabulary, low reading, having the skills, understanding and understanding and keeping up with the pace, that's sort of the listening comprehension. I think a lot of times that's one of the most neglected components, I think, of instruction, is really thinking about what they're able to understand, accessing the components of complex text, and academic instruction and limited vocabulary. So those are all things that we're going to talk about. And one of the things you're going to see is that these are all pieces that right? We've talked about all of these, but it's thinking about how to put them together so you leverage sort of the momentum and what children are learning. So I want to start with this piece because I really think it's very central to what we're doing here today. Education can and should change children's access. It can be an equalizer, right? We're educators, we all know this. It is the means for ensuring that students are exposed to intellectually stimulating content at an early age that will engage and inspire them to learn, right? We all know that kids love, especially science, but also social studies. They love learning about things. They're intrigued by the world. So our role is to keep thinking of ways to make sure they never lose that interest. Academic language, content vocabulary, and concept building are all critical to the development of critical thinking and should be part of instruction. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here today is how do we, really think about using those in ways that, like I said, can leverage and help students. So we all know that there's a connection with language and comprehension, but it's also the link to content learning. This is from Shepherd Girl. It is through language that school subjects are taught and through language that students' understanding of content. Sorry, I'm just trying to get stuff out of the way. Understanding of concepts is displayed and evaluated in school context, right? So again, we know this. And so our role is how do we help children who are learning English as a second language to be successful in this process? So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those components that we talked about. First is academic language and disciplinary literacy. Those are sort of the two cornerstones of what this is about. So we all know that academic language is the breadth and depth of vocabulary knowledge, including multiple meanings to read and understand expository texts. We know that it appears more often in text than in oral conversation, unless we're talking about debates or other kinds of formal discussions. It's specific academic vocabulary needed to compare historical events, state and reflect on different points of view. And it also includes complex sentence structures and corresponding syntax, right? So that's sort of a very broad definition of what academic language is. And one of the things you're going to notice throughout this presentation is that I talk about academic language. I will talk about academic vocabulary a little bit, but really to think about language in a more broadly, academic language. So when we say academic vocabulary, a lot of people tend to think about individual words. And as this notes, it's more about the complexity of sentences or how sentences and syntax are used in different disciplines. And disciplinary knowledge are the knowledge and skills in a discipline that support young people in becoming active participants in society. And it builds understanding of how knowledge is produced in the disciplines rather than just building knowledge in the disciplines, right? So we often hear a lot, oh, we want them to think, like scientists or historians or, and talk like them. But we, other than sort of some sort of superficial attempts at that, we don't really think about the thinking part of it. Is how do we construct knowledge and how is that different from just learning it and repeating it, right? So those are the kinds, that's the level we want kids to reach. I just want to say that at any point, it's kind of hard to see because I can't see any of you. I will stop from point to point for questions or comments. But if you have something you want to say, just kind of either wave or throw something into the chat box. So here, let's look at examples of those things. So what are the key characteristics of social studies text? Well, it's referential relations that enable readers to keep track of objects, people, and events mentioned in the text, right? So already that tells us that the way we approach this text and how we have to think about it and what's important and what isn't matters. There's a lot of causal logical relation that enable readers to identify how different events or facts depend on or cause each other across various genres. So again, giving us a hint about how to approach the text. And then there's 4 major genres that vary in purpose and structure in social studies text. Historical recounts retell events in a sequence. Historical accounts describe why things happen in a particular sequence. Cause and effect texts provide the basis for explanations of past events. And historical argument advocates for a particular explanation, right? So the good thing is we can teach kids about these, but we also want to make sure that from an early age, they're exposed to these different kinds of text. So if that's what the texts are, what kind of reading skills do they need? Well, they need to be able to remember names and sequence of events. That's the basic, and that's what a lot of people do. But they also need to critically interpret historical texts, right? And so what does that mean? Well, when we're reading about history and events, and I think nothing is as clear as it has been in the last few years, right? The source of the information, right? Where did this information come from? Where did this point of view come from? And they do that by ascertaining the authorship, what kind of document it is, and where it came from. Contextualizing the source of information by thinking about the time period and what we know about the political, social, economic, and cultural conditions at the time. So, what was going on, when, an unrest happened? What were the political, what was going on socially, economically? What were the cultural conditions? All those things are important to understand, right? So that tells us that history isn't this point or this event that happens in a vacuum, right? It happens in a context that we have to understand. And they must see corroboration for the information presented. So is this a widely held view, or is it, from one camp or another? So understanding that. And so to accomplish that, they have to look for agreement and disagreements within the text and with their point of view. So this shows us that disciplinary literacy and understanding is very different, right? It's not and maybe of the way some of us were taught, right? Of just sort of reading and memorizing, right? It's really thinking about and critiquing even after the fact, events that happened. The vocabulary describes people and events in general. So there's a lot of names, but there's also metaphorical terms such as manifest destiny or turbulent past that require background knowledge, right? So we have to think about, especially for students who are learning English as a second language, how that might affect their understanding, right? Their comprehension. And also, but also think about what does that mean for our vocabulary instruction, right? We can't just think about teaching words, right? We have to think about making sure that they understand the context of what is written. And finally, we have sourcing, right? And we talked a little bit about the other, right? This is another skill that's important to social studies, and that is the historical reasoning to interpret source material, and again, we teach students to answer these 3 questions, to support reasoning and explanation, to find evidence of bias, to determine if the text is biased, right? So part of understanding is teaching these additional skills. So this was just an example to show how, understanding what's required of each content, we could provide the same information for science. It's important to start teaching this at a very young age. So before I move on, there is a question that said, these are, oh yeah, they definitely are. It's not a question. These are language functions for ELS2. Oh, definitely. And actually this framework that I'm going to talk about, maybe I should give you a little bit of background. When we first developed it in middle school, our goal was to help the comprehension and vocabulary development of English learners in middle school. And it had the components that I'm going to share. And I have just as background knowledge, when we implemented it, the kids that were in the intervention condition who received this, after we finished the English learner, I mean, first of all, both groups learned. Monolingual English speakers and English learners both improved in both vocabulary and comprehension. But the interesting part, or the good part or positive result was the English learners in the intervention condition came close to, and I think surpassed in some areas, the English monolingual students in the control condition. So it really gave them a boost in terms of both vocabulary and comprehension. So what is this framework? It's multi-component. Like I said, it builds disciplinary knowledge, includes effective practices, and includes to build language, academic language, and disciplinary knowledge, and to just build literacy skills more generally. And here they are. So we have a vocabulary, and we focus both on disciplinary vocabulary and general academic words. So general academic vocabulary are words that can be used across different content areas. Disciplinary vocabulary are words that are specific to a specific discipline. We use discussion to help build academic language. Reading for informational text and comprehension strategies, and then writing to develop academic language and writing skills and strategies. And I should say, even though I have them listed here, we don't always use them in this order, right? It kind of depends on a couple of things. One is, are we just introducing this content for this first time, or is it the second or third day, right? And so we might, and the examples I'm going to show later on will give you an idea of how to use it differently. So that before I get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about language objectives because, and this is from the SIOP model. So those of you that know SIOP are very familiar with this. But language objectives ensure that students have opportunities to learn and practice academic language and to be assessed on that knowledge and skills. I think sometimes we forget because language is so dynamic that that we can systematically make sure we're teaching and ensuring that students are learning the academic language we know they need, right? So objectives can focus on vocabulary, on language functions, structures, demands or forms, and language learning strategies, right? So we really want to think systematically about how we're helping students develop these language functions that they need. And then ESL, special education, and general education teachers can collaborate to identify the appropriate language objectives based on content to be taught, students' stage of language development, and specific learning needs, right? So the goal here is to be more inclusive and to find ways of how working together, teachers can help kids build this language, right? We know language isn't, I mean, we can teach kids vocabularies and to memorize definitions, but that's not language learning, right? That's not what we want. It's important that they know definitions, but we want them to get to the point where they're using language, right? And so that requires more time and more collaboration between all the teachers that work with students. So here again, if you know SciUp, you know these are the steps: identifying vocabulary, concept words, or other academic words. But here's the important part: determine who will teach vocabulary. So for example, the ESL teacher can focus on words that will not be taught by the general education teacher, but are not known for else. So when we're talking about content area, one thing we know is you're teaching a new topic, there's going to be words all your kids need to learn, right? It's a new topic. If they already knew it all, then there's not a lot of reason for you to be teaching it, right? So we know there's things that everybody's going to need. That's something the general ed teacher. But we all know that the students who are learning English as a new language may need other vocabulary, right? Or some of those phrases. Or sometimes it might be, things like manifest destiny, which is not only metaphorical, but it's very US contextualized. It's very US context based, right? If you've not studied that before, it's going to be new. So, thinking about those kinds of things. Then identify other language skills that are needed for the lesson and decide who will teach them. So, if it's going to be a writing task, they can decide whether students would benefit from more focus on syntax for a specific genre or discourse level. And then the ESL teacher can focus on teaching syntax, while special education teachers can teach students strategies that will generalize, right? So again, always thinking about how together to build these things. Then identify scaffolds, and then importantly, with any kind of language objective, evaluate their progress to mastery and determine next steps. As I said at the very beginning, and I'll repeat because it really is important, language development is essential for literacy and content learning. So we don't want it to be sort of a random process, right? We want to make sure we're sort of building that foundation, sort of brick by brick, to ensure that students are getting what they need. So what do they need? They need something to talk about, right? So, that goes back to sort of that engaging, motivating, interesting. What do kids find interesting? Or how do we make things that they may not find so interesting seem interesting, right? And so we need to give them something to talk about. Then, more important, the language to talk about it, right? It's hard to say, talk about this, if you don't have the vocabulary or the syntax to do it. And then lots of opportunities to talk, listen, read, and write. So before I get into that, are there any questions or comments?
You can unmute yourself or throw your questions in the chat. I actually had a question.
Okay.
And you spoke about the, maybe your EL teachers taught this set of vocabulary, and your regular education teacher might, teach this set of vocabulary. How critical is the continuity of that routines and the consistency of those routines, and how do we get that continuity in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it actually is related to another study we did also in middle school many years ago. And I mean, I think that the routines are helpful for a lot of students. And the consistency of language is particularly helpful for both students with learning disabilities and students who are learning English as a second language, right? Because it allows them to focus on the content rather than like, wait, what are they asking me to do now? But one of the things we did in a study many years ago in a middle school where teachers worked in vertical teams is that, and where a lot of the children were having difficulty with just literacy, is we identified 4 strategies: a vocabulary strategy, partner reading for fluency, collaborative strategic reading for comprehension. There might have been one more, but basically all the teachers, content teachers, everybody, special ed teachers, ESL support, everybody learned these strategies. And then all the teachers sort of took turns introducing them and teaching them in their class, but all the other teachers supported it in their class, right? So one of the things was, if the kids learned dissect, which is a strategy for decoding multisyllabic words, the teachers all knew, the students knew that. So after it had been introduced in practice, if a student couldn't read that, the teacher could say, use the dissect strategy. And the student knew what it was, right? So they had these strategies that were portable across all the content areas. And, and then 2 good things is the teachers could say, do this, and the students knew that they were going to be held accountable, right? They couldn't say, oh, I don't know that. It's like, yes, you learned it in this class and everybody's using it. So that's one way to sort of maximize. And I think that would work in elementary schools too, where if you have sort of routines that you use for specific areas or to teach specific skills, then it's something that kids sort of learn, right? It becomes a tool for the students, and it's something that the teachers can use in terms of accountability and for supporting kids that need the additional support.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now if there's no other questions, I'll keep going. So give them something to talk about. So these are the way we did it is big ideas, which are concepts or principles that facilitate the most efficient and broadest acquisition of knowledge. But basically it was sort of questions to get kids intrigued, right? So what are we going to learn? Well, how do animals change as they grow? How do we get what we need, right? So something like that can be done in 1st grade and it can be done in 10th grade, right? You just sort of change the level of the readings, of the discussion, of the vocabulary, right? What's worth protecting? Again, something that can be used at any grade level. What forces can change the earth, right? So kind of thinking about that. And when you think about topics like this, what's worth protecting, or how do we get what we need? Kids can start engaging in those conversations in kindergarten, 1st grade, and then, their knowledge and their ability to talk about it, keeps evolving over time if they're giving opportunities to keep talking about it at different levels. So to build the academic literacy, we started or used instruction on rich content, because you have to have content to build conceptual knowledge and language. And then infuse language and literacy into daily instruction. So children are exposed to language largely through teacher talk and text, right? So one of the pieces that we used a lot was discussion, right? Because we want children to use the language. And then don't separate big ideas and critical thinking from language. I think a lot of times, when we're talking about children who are learning English as a second language, there's still this idea that we have to simplify language. And I should rephrase that. We do have to simplify language, but thinking about when we simplify language, you also simplify content, right? And I know that's been in discussion for a long time. And I think it's finding the sort of that nice balance of like, how do we keep the content robust, but make sure that we have different levels of language access for students that need it. So let's start with vocabulary. So one of the things that we always have is explicit vocabulary instruction, right? We want to make sure that that there's certain core words that are critical that students understand. So we always start with pronouncing the word as a teacher and then having students pronounce the word, right? And again, for second language learners, this is very important because a lot of times when they see it written, they might have heard it, but because of the spelling, they don't connect the word that they know receptively with the one they're seeing in front of them, right? So if we write the word, pronounce it, they pronounce it, right? It starts linking all those things together. The second thing is we work on word consciousness, right? And this is a metalinguistic skill, right? And so back from in 1965, we had these levels that Dale gave us about knowing a word, right? So you hear a word, and like, do you never heard of the word before? Don't know anything about it. The next level is heard of it, but have no idea what it means. So just kind of know it's a word. Recognize generally what it means, but cannot provide a specific description, right? So that's when you hear a word and it's kind of like if I say sous vide, which, I know is something to do with cooking, but if I had to describe the process, I couldn't give it to you because I don't know what it is, right? But I know sort of the general realm and where it belongs. And then the last is to know the word well and can use it and understand meaning when the word is used orally and in writing. So, sort of developing again for kids learning English as a second language, this is a really critical metalinguistic skill, right? They need to recognize when they hear a word, sort of kind of automatically start looking like, what do I know about this word? Right. And I could add in there that for second language learners, it could be as like, does this sound like a word I do in my first language? Do I know the meaning of the word? Could it be that words, right? So kind of that cognate connection or, translating connection. So really for them, there's sort of that extra layer of sort of trying to place these words that they're learning and also get the correct definition for it. The next one I know you guys have heard a lot about because you come to this conference and you've heard Anita Archer talk about it a lot is student-friendly definitions, right? So we provide that for students. And, I would say because it's good that they learn sort of the English definition, but for kids that are learning English as a second language, it's also important that they be able to write it in whatever is going to help them remember it, right? So whether it's another language, which is whatever, to sketch a little picture, giving them something to hang on to. Then give examples and non-examples, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then, lots of opportunities to encounter the word throughout the lesson, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about. Another example of how to work with kids is powerful sentences. So again, just, this is an example of what they can do to learn the word, right? It's they're having to use the words and demonstrate that they understand the meaning. So here's the next poll. Could you launch it, please, Brad? This is with discussion and how much discussion you use in your classroom. Great. Well, it sounds like most of you use it every day or twice a week, at least twice a week, which is great. And a little bit once a week. So these are, so that's good because we know it's really critical to developing language. So discussions are characterized by student-dominated talk and interactions that are a mix of statements, questions, and students and teachers. And I think the critical point here is that it's student-dominated talk, right? We want students to be doing most of the talking. Um, Start with engaging rich text that features academic vocabulary and complex ideas, but it could also be a video or other source of input about content. And it provides structured opportunities to use vocabulary words taught, to use vocabulary associated with content, and to compare information from various formats. So, basically we just want children to engage in language, to be thinking about what they're learning. Exploratory talk involves students talking for learning and thinking and includes predicting outcomes and hypothesizing, clarifying ideas, offering suggestions, or challenging other children's ideas, right? So again, it's more than just what do you know about this, but really, and it might start with that, but then once they've read, once they've gotten some more information, structuring it more about talking about the content. What do I know? What do I think? And I know all of you have used sentence frames. Sentence frames are great not only for discussion, for oral language, but they're also great for written language, right? It's just a scaffold for students that need it so that they can be confident when using academic language, right? And so again, these are things like they can practice with the ESL teacher if they have a separate time for that. And the nice thing about a lot of sentence frames around academic language, for example, is sort of compare and contrast, is that they're basic and you can use them across content areas, right, across the disciplines. So once students start to learn specific frames for compare and contrast, or for presenting an argument, those are things that are generalizable. So what do we do with discussions? Well, when we start out, allow them to discuss new ideas in pairs or small groups. And I have to tell you, in that middle school study that we did many years ago, those of you that have middle schools or have taught middle school, middle school kids, right? And so sometimes when we'd start out, we'd say, have them work in pairs. And I remember one time I was in a classroom and they were told to discuss something, and I was just walking around sort of listening to the different pairs, and I got to a pair, and they were both kind of sitting there, with their arms crossed, just looking at me. They wouldn't even look at each other. And I just stood there and waited a little while, and I kind of prompted them to do the activity, and they just kind of looked at me. And then finally I said, well, I'm just going to stay here until you guys start talking. And sure enough, after a couple of minutes, well, maybe it seemed like more, but it was probably just a couple, they started doing it, right? So, part of it, I think, was just being in middle school. Part of it was sort of a new practice for them. It wasn't something they were used to doing. The other one, if you have large enough numbers of children who share the same language, or even just a few, is to allow them to use their first language to process new information. So, this is sort of that translanguaging idea of, especially with older kids, but even sometimes, upper elementary too, they know about things. They might have learned about the solar system before. They just don't have the language. And so if we allow them to sort of talk about it, about the content, it gives them sort of that boost that to say, oh yeah, content, you're learning this content, it's just the language, right? And so then once they've gotten their ideas out, we can help them sort of transfer that to English, right? But it sort of kind of breaks down that first barrier of I can't talk about this because I don't have the language. And then we can help them make that transition by ensuring that they understand keywords and have access to key language needed to discuss. And then again, the sentence frames is another place that helps support that. So finally, we have comprehension. And like I said, background knowledge has really become a very critical piece of comprehension. So we can have students brainstorm to access content knowledge, right? So it activates schema that aids in understanding and memory. And again, this is where sort of helping kids with cognates or, allowing to discuss in their first language helps activate that. It's like, what do you know? As opposed to what can you say or do in English, right? So there's a big difference for kids between those two things. Helps students make connections, and it alerts teachers to students' misconceptions. And then building content knowledge, right? So the other part of it is a lot of times when we're coming into a new topic, we want to make sure everybody has sort of the same general basic knowledge about the topic, right? So we are going to build content knowledge so that we know that everybody's starting in the same place. And we can do that through videos, through pictures, in a lot of different ways. So like I said, we when we wanted sort of that even starting point, we use video clips. Questions are posed prior to reading or watching a video clip. So again, we prompted kids about what to pay attention to, and then we had students work in pairs to answer, right? So it wasn't a video clip just for the sake of watching a video, but really prompting them. The other thing that we found with English learners, that if we post, we gave them post the questions prior to them watching the video clip or reading, they were able to know what to attend to, right? So there were words and keywords that they can listen to. And then just the importance of informational text. I think this is more common now, but I think especially for students who are learning English as a second language, if they're in bilingual classrooms, I think it's critical that they get the content in their first language, but also start being exposed to the sort of label to what they've learned the concept, right? So if in math, they've learned the shapes in Spanish, during ESL or some other time, make sure they're learning the labels. It's like, oh, you already know that this is, a triangle, triángulo. In English, we say triangle, right? So just kind of pairing those things for them, from a very early stage, so that they learn the concept in the language they know best, but start learning the labels in English so that they have them when they need them later on. And then finally, writing. And here I'm not going to focus so much on the writing skills, but really thinking more about sort of the critical thinking piece, right? So if you've worked around writing, you know that there's a difference between knowledge retelling and knowledge transformation when it comes to writing. So knowledge telling is tell as much as you know, right? And so that just means that, you learn something and you sort of repeat what you just learned in writing. But knowledge transforming are the ideas are retrieved from memory and transform and must provide an explanation or justify a position. So this requires background knowledge, analysis and synthesis skills, language skills, and cognitive skills. So I'm going to give you an example of the difference between these two that I thought of. One time I was at a conference and I went to a session on how to teach. It was a conference focused on writing, and it was about teaching writing to children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Oh, no, sorry. They were blind because we were learning how to do Braille. And so they taught us how to read Braille, sort of some of the structures about Braille. And like how to write numbers and how to mark capitals, all these kinds of things. So if I was doing knowledge telling or knowledge retelling, I could write about, when you write Braille, you use the sequence to write number, or when you write Braille, you mark capital letters by doing this, or, whatever all the things were, which unfortunately I've already forgotten some of them. But then knowledge transforming would be, it's like, okay, so that's interesting. This is how you teach Braille. I know a lot about, just teaching writing, so how are these things similar or different, right? What would I need to know, or what can I change, or what can I leverage from what I know that might be useful to children who are learning to write in Braille, right? So it's that now I'm just not taking exactly what I learned. I'm taking what I learned and relating it to what I know and trying to think about how those two could or could not work together, how it might expand one or the other, right? And so that's what we want kids to be able to do. So it's not right, tell the events that led to to the War of 1812, it's like, think about the causes. How is it similar or different to other, conflicts? So, those kinds of things. That's what we're talking about here. So, when we can give them something to think and talk about, and the language to use to discuss it, language models that are comprehensible, and then the opportunities to communicate, right? So one of the things that's a tool that's very powerful are graphic organizers, right? Because that's something that we use for reading comprehension. We use it to get ready for writing. We can use it for language learning, right? It's a way to communicate these ideas. Right? So prior to writing, they can assist students to organize and integrate information, their thoughts and vocabulary, better understand the discipline, make connections among and between concepts, right? So that would be, a graphic organizer would be a good way for them to, I start here, this is what my information, here's more information, right? So just as a way to keep building what they've learned. And here we just have practices, model writing strategies, use a variety of ways to select topics. Again, I think particularly important in organized ideas, particularly important for students learning English as a second language. Again, because they might feel like they know a lot about topics, but then if they sort of put up the barrier of, but can I talk about it in English? If they're doing English instruction, that changes it, right? For kids who are getting instruction in their first language, it's not as much of an issue. Okay. So basically, we're talking about the integration, right? So thoughtful language production, both written and oral, demonstrates and consolidates vocabulary knowledge and conceptual knowledge. Plus, we know that vocabulary instruction and writing instruction together can improve overall writing quality, right? So again, thinking about how all the pieces that you're teaching, how to connect them in a way that helps kids do that, how to leverage it. So before I go into examples, are there any questions or comments?
Doesn't look like it, Sylvia.
Okay. So we're going to start with middle, I have 3 examples. That's what we're going to be doing the rest. One is a middle and high school, one is lower elementary, and one is a little bit upper elementary. So here we go. So we're going to talk about black holes. And so what I'd like for you to do now is write 1 or 2 things that you know about black holes. Okay, would any okay. So they exist in space, right? So if we go back sort of for that to that sort of level, you know something about them in the context in which it exists. They're collapsed stars. Things get lost in them. I know that I know very little about black holes. So, those are a few of the starting questions. Okay. So, but what if, before I asked you to discuss that, I taught you these few these few vocabulary words: singularity, which is the center of a black hole, and it's right here. Event horizon, the edge where the gravity becomes strong enough to hold light, which is right here. You can see where you can see where the, sorry, I lost there we go. You can see where it's white and then it gets totally blank. And then the acceleration disk is the gas and dust and other matter that are drawn toward the black hole, right? So these are the things right outside of the event horizon. So already, just with this little bit of knowledge, you could say a lot more about black holes, and use the correct vocabulary to talk about them. Now, if I were, wait a minute, I gotta do this in a different order.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad will bond. This is the kitchen where the new boyfriend will unofficially...
Okay, hold on.
Black holes are the most powerful things in the universe, strong enough to rip whole stars into atom-sized pieces. While this is scary enough, they have an even more powerful and dark property. They might delete the universe itself.
Hold on, it takes a minute to do all this because oh no. Sorry, teeny tiny screen and lots of stuff going on.
A lot to manage. No worries, we're patient.
Okay.
Here we go.
So now here's a video about black holes.
Black holes in a nutshell. A black hole appears when an extraordinary amount of matter is concentrated in a tiny space. At their center, gravity is almost infinitely strong, and whatever gets too close is ripped into its elementary particles. Not even light can escape black holes, and so we perceive them as spheres of blackness. If you were to fall into a black hole, nothing bad would happen until well after you crossed its outer border, the event horizon. You can imagine this as swimming in a river that ends in an enormous waterfall. As you float along, imperceptibly, the stream gets faster and faster, even if you can't see the waterfall yet. You could swim to safety until, without even noticing it, you cross the point of no return. No matter how fast you try to swim now, the stream will pull you towards certain death. Nothing can escape a black hole waterfall once it gets too close. This border completely separates black holes from the rest of the universe. We can't access them unless we're willing to never return. So there's no way of telling what's really going on inside black holes, but we have a few ideas about what's going on right at their very edges. Black holes radiate their mass away, like a hot pot on a stove.
Okay. So after just that short video, you have a lot more information that you can use to not only talk about black holes, but understand what they are and how they work, right? And so that's really the important part. So part of this is, focusing on the concepts, right? What do we want them to know related to the content, right? What are the concepts? But then making sure they have the language to be able to talk about those concepts, right? So, they've watched the video. Now, everybody has at least the same understanding about what they are, You can have a discussion immediately after that about black holes and the roles of an event horizon, um, to kind of solidify what they just saw, get them to start using that language. Then they can read about black holes. So by the time they get to reading about black holes, they really understand that concept, right? They really understand a lot of the vocabulary that's associated with it and the concepts themselves. And so approaching this reading is going to be a lot easier for most of the students at this point. And then if it's in terms of writing, they can conduct an experiment. Sorry. And write a report on results, right? Which is a type of writing that we do in science. So this is just sort of like a super quick, but just sort of kind of looking at the components. And like I said, I mean, in instruction, I probably wouldn't do the vocabulary with the picture and then the video right afterwards. I might do the video first, again, just to sort of get them an understanding about what it is we're going to be studying and then move from there. So what this would look like in a lower elementary classroom. Is, let's say we're talking about animal camouflage, right? So our guiding questions are big is like, what does it take to survive? When is it good to blend in? When is it better to stand out? Identify the content words here for vocabulary. So we have the ones, and then in academic words, right? So the academic words are things that we know that they've learned across content that can be used across content areas. So if we know that they've already seen defend in another context or survive, right, we might just want to let them know what it would be or how it's going to be used in this context. Identify language functions, so structures that they can pre-teach, right? So getting them ready for writing or getting them ready for discussing. Blank can hide by, blank changes blank to hide from other animals. And then the concepts that are important, camouflage, patterns, enemies, right? So thinking broadly about the language and the ideas that they're going to talk about. Then they're going to read a text. We might come back and do something like a Freyer model for the word adaptation, right? It's a big concept for kids. So it's the ways, that animals change over time to survive. We would model this. We know that change happens over a long time. They can be biological, how they look, or behavioral, how they act, right? And so then we get to examples and non-examples. So what are examples of adaptations? Well, one example is when animals change colors from summer to winter so that they can hide from their enemies. In the summer, they might be brown, so they can fit in with the ground, and in the winter, they're white because so they can hide in the snow for animals that live in areas where there's a lot of snow. But kids might think that other animals that they've learned about that change as they grow, that might be an example of adaptation, like butterflies or a frog, right? And so those are not examples of adaptation because they're happened just within the life cycle, right? It didn't happen over a long time, right? And so kind of having these discussions and having kids have these discussions after they've read and learned about it, kind of helps you see what they understood as well as how well they're understanding the words, right? And then finish with a writing activity. So identifying ways that animals blend in or stand out. List 2 or 3 animals that use that adaptation, right? So you identify a way and then you identify the animals. So then the last example for upper elementary is this one on volcanoes, right? So here we're starting with building background visually. So a short video on volcanoes and how they erupt, especially for kids, just like the black hole that maybe had never seen a volcano. again, vocabulary, language practice, student-friendly sentences and illustrations. Here are the key words that we're teaching. More keywords. So here's the academic vocabulary. The other was science vocabulary. And then sort of getting them to start thinking about it. So they've learned vocabulary and they've read about volcanoes, and they've read a informative text on volcanoes, but they've also read a legend on volcanoes from the Hawaiian Islands. So we want them to discuss their understanding with a partner. So we give them these sentence frames to get them started, right? So we pair up the kids. One is partner A, the other one is partner B, something they're used to doing. So the partner A starts a discussion. I think volcanoes are, and they give what they think it is, or based on what they've read in the past, people believe that volcanoes, whatever it is that they've learned, to start the discussion. Then in terms of accountable talk, we give partner B sentence frames, or we give them when they're first learning them. I agree with you, but I agree with you, and I disagree with you because I hadn't thought of that. It makes me think of, right? So now we're giving them a way to respond. So, we're teaching kids, again, from a very early age, to build on those language skills, right? And to have a way to discuss the content that they're learning, right? And sort of the facts of what they've learned and how they apply, but it also helps them start making connections with other things they know, right? So that when it gets time for them to write, they have already seen a video, they've already talked about it, they've read about it, right? And they've used the language that they're going to need to write, right? Which is the important part. A lot of times kids don't get that time to use the language and then have to go back to writing. And so they sort of revert back to either the retelling, which is not a bad thing, but it doesn't sort of get them to that next level, or they use language that's not precise or sometimes maybe incorrect, right? So by giving them these opportunities to discuss and use the language orally, then when they go to write, they've all already familiar with it. So I think we have just a little bit of time. I kind of rushed because I like to do this part. So now, I know you guys know about volcanoes because we live in Oregon, and, we have a big volcano chain right down the middle, or maybe 1/3 of the way. So think about what you know. Here it says read, but about volcanoes. Brainstorm 10 to 15 words related to volcanoes. Include some adjectives, nouns, and verbs. But you can just do that in your head, but then organize words into lines for a poem. So when you write your poem, make sure that you're using the vocabulary words, but that it also contains factual information about volcanoes that we have learned. So in the chat box, there's a link to a Jamboard, a Google Jamboard. If you wish to participate and share your poem, you can put it in the Jamboard. And if you just want to write it for yourself, that's okay too. And I'm gonna, I should open the Jamboard first. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jamboards, but there's sticky notes here. You can get a sticky note and write on it, and when you're ready, save it, and it'll save. There's a marker up here. You can just write. There's a text box you can drag over. A text box, and you can write inside the text box. And if you don't want to share, that's okay too. And if you don't want to share your written poem, but you want to perform it, that's okay too. Okay. Okay, so we'll look at the two that we have. Oh, here comes another one. Okay. Oh, you guys are super creative. Wow. Thank you. Okay, would somebody like to read their poem?
I will read mine. Can you,
Okay.
it's the Green Mountains one. Can you make it a little bit bigger so I can read it? Since I didn't write it in my notebook.
Okay, let's see. Okay.
Thank you. Green Mountain with a thin line of smoke escaping until whoosh, ash, pumice, and clouds fly into the air like so many migratory birds starting their journey. The lifeblood leaks down the sides and fires start. Volcano.
All right, thank you. So thinking about the task, right? Does this indicate that she understood the content? Yes, right. So she describes the process, adds some nice imagery to go with it. But at the core of it, we know that that's what happens with volcanoes, right? The ash and pumice and clouds fly into the air. So great, thank you. Anybody else want to share theirs?
I can share mine. Mine is the green sticky note. Age old, full of wisdom, unpredictable, or perhaps not. Heat within, beauty abounds.
Great, thank you. So does this sort of give us an idea of what we know about volcanoes? Yes, right. They are old. They're unpredictable, or maybe not. Maybe we just don't know how to predict them, right? And then heat within and beauty abounds. And I would say definitely, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So thank you. Anybody else?
Mine is on the pink sticky note.
Uh-huh.
It reads, the lava flows along the subduction zone, majestic beauty, but eruption lurks.
Thank you. So definitely a lot of good vocabulary used in there, in that poem. And somebody added a beautiful photo.
That's kind. Very
Is
nice.
that Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood? I don't know. I don't know my mountains here yet. Good. So, and then we have a couple of others. So volcanoes erupt, they can be dormant for years, beautiful mountains, right? So again, accurate content in describing what was important to that person. And we have one about St. Helens. St. Helens is a mountain up north. When it blows, the ashes spew forth. It just wouldn't stop. Oh, when it blew off its top 14 days after May 4th. Oh, wow. So this is actually a reflection of something that happened here. And you all had to live through if you were living here at the time. So that's a sort of a personal connection to the topic. And then we have one more. Once active, creating land in the ocean, dormant now, icy snow, playground for adventure, fractures creating hot springs that cure outside my kitchen window. Wow. Again, also, providing sort of a personal connection to volcanoes and what you know about them. So thank you all that participated and shared your poems with us, and just to sort of show the different ways in which we can engage children, not only with different types of literacy, but also with different ways to share what they know about the content. So we're almost out of time. So if there's any last questions or comments.